Meanwhile City. What is the power of temporary interventions in shaping cities? Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski, and this is the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, architecture, cities, and many more. Today, I would love to invite you to the discussion about the temporary use in our cities and in urban planning. Temporary use, short-term use, or placemaking can be vital for cities to adapt to change, revitalize spaces, test new ideas, and communicate with the public. We will discuss The Meanwhile City, which is a book conceived and produced by Milk, which is a multidisciplinary team of strategists, designers, and editors, led by the architect Petra Marko, who built local identities for cities, districts, and places. The book, created by Milk, gathers great case studies and knowledge on how to effectively implement temporary use in cities and how can we make our cities more attractive. We will focus on how placemaking and temporary use can shape our cities and communities. What are the key insights for successful temporary use projects? What is the role of long-term funding in creating those projects? And how can we react to gentrification, which might be a possible side effect of placemaking? Today's guest, Petra Marko, is architect and urbanist, placemaking director at Milk, and the co-author of Meanwhile City. She spent most of her career working in the UK, especially in London, and this is also where she co-founded Marko and Placemakers, which is a city and research consultancy based on transformational principles of placemaking and green urbanism established in 2013. So let's dive into the temporary use in the Meanwhile City with Petra. I'm happy that you joined Urbcast. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Marcin. Thanks for having me.
I'm happy that we had a chance to meet because you've been visiting Copenhagen, not for the first time. And I'm very curious, what did you like in Copenhagen the most?
Well, Copenhagen always has some surprises. It's been amazing to see how the city is evolving and transforming. I visited first time, I think back in 2005, and I was fascinated by all the new architecture, which already by then had sprung up in the various parts around the city. And I particularly enjoy the easiness of the public spaces. And in the summer when we visited, my son loved the rooftop playground in Nordhavnen.
Yes.
It's by Yaya Architects, and it's got amazing views as well. And I like the really simple projects which seem simple, but I know how difficult they are to realize, such as Israel's Platz, which has been a transformation of formerly a really big parking lot, and now is this amazing square with sports grounds and with a food hall next door to it. So I think there's always something new to discover, and I look forward to my next visit.
Yes, definitely. I mean, those transformation projects, but also temporary projects that we will talk about today, they are present here in Copenhagen, and I was also happy to discover them here because I'm a big fan of the how you call it, the meanwhile use myself. And also the background for this conversation is that I've managed to discover your recent book, the publication about the meanwhile use, about the temporary interventions and how they create our places in different cities, places with stronger identities and also communities. And before we talk about those different case studies and deep dive into the meanwhile use, I would like to ask you about the definition of the placemaking and maybe also your understanding of placemaking.
I'm an architect and urban designer by training, and I've spent over 15 years practicing in London and recently moved back to Bratislava, where I'm originally from. And placemaking for me is about creating opportunities for people to develop relationship to the place, and whether that's through acupunctural changes in public space or whether it's through complete renovation of a square or a street or a city quarter or a neighborhood. It depends case by case, but the essence of it is really to enable for people to have that sense of mental ownership of the streets, the public space. And in that sense, then they also take care of the space, or they don't damage it. They have a positive relationship to it. They feel that it is for them. So placemaking is very much about this relationship and enabling the relationship to happen. So it's quite a tactical process, because it requires people to engage, genuinely engage, and it needs to be authentic. You can't impose it, but you can put certain key elements into the process to help this process along.
Did this definition change over time, over the years? Because as you've mentioned, you've been involved with those placemaking projects and also practicing architecture, urban design for many, many years. So if we compare the moment that you were first introduced to the placemaking, to the meanwhile use, did your understanding of that change?
I think for me, the ideas around placemaking emerged from being really interested in infrastructure. So back when I was still studying, I did my architecture degree in Vienna, but then I traveled to London to do my diploma project, which was about the London Underground and Tottenham Court Road tube station, which, for those who know London a little bit, is a very complex interchange, which by now, 2022, also has a Crossrail stop. So it's the tube, the new Crossrail, but also it's at the end of Oxford Street. There are some really interesting buildings on this junction, some of them that had to be demolished because of the construction of the new Crossrail line. And I was trying back then as a student to sort of unravel and unpick a really complex infrastructure project and make it more livable and accessible for people, sort of unlocking this point in the city. Because for me, infrastructure is about creating access to spaces rather than being just about mobility where you get from A to B. It's about actually enabling the city to work better for everyone. And so I think back when I was studying architecture, I was always gravitating to those in-between spaces and always picking the studios and the ateliers at school, which enabled me to experiment in between the buildings, if you like.
If you mention the infrastructure, at least to me, it sounds like a hardscape, like a hard element. So how can we make the infrastructure into more of a soft one? So it's just more user-friendly in a way.
I think the train station, the main central station in Rotterdam, is a brilliant example. So Rotterdam Central, which is the main train station, had been quite a difficult hub with lots of transport modes at street level, with kind of the trams, the trains, the buses, taxis, cars. And it was really cluttered and really difficult to navigate for pedestrians. And the project of renovating the station and sort of building a new station really masterfully sort of interconnected all these modes, really complex, again, interchange. Lots of it is underground. And then as part of the process of that project, which was commissioned by the city of Rotterdam, which is an important point because infrastructure projects in the city are supposed to generate a public benefit. So I think it's really important that local authorities sort of lead in terms of commissioning them. Of course, there were different partners, so it was public-private partnership, but the city of Rotterdam, I think, was crucial in that process. And instead of just getting a new station, they really wanted, as part of the brief, to create this civic space. So the architects had actually managed to completely declutter the space in front of the station and then created this civic plaza, this new gateway to the city. Quite a few articles or research points to that the transformation of Central Station in Rotterdam, along with a few other critical projects in the city, had really pushed Rotterdam up in terms of the competitiveness of the city. In the Netherlands, cities are very near each other and they really compete for talent, for people to live there. And the decisions that people make about where they're going to locate themselves nowadays are not around just moving between A and B. Again, it's about the livable qualities of the place. It's about the quality of the public transport. It's about the quality of the public spaces and amenities and parks and all of those things. So I think the Rotterdam Central Station is a beautiful example how you can actually use an infrastructure project to create a civic project, which is a new gateway into the city. And it's not just about technically mastering the different transport modes. But that's a really important part. So you have to manage to do that in order to deliver those additional benefits.
Definitely, Rotterdam became this hotspot on the map of many people, but especially architects. I remember myself when I was still studying and wondering about which direction should I take. Rotterdam, with different big architecture offices, there was one of the directions to go, that it was like a very, very industrial city, not very inviting. But as you've mentioned, those projects managed to change the brand of the whole city. This is something that interests me a lot while talking about the placemaking and also while talking about the meanwhile use. How does it influence the city's brand, the city's kind of marketing?
It can be sort of generalized. So you can sort of say that this one project had this one meanwhile project had changed this or that city. But in a way, if you think about Barcelona Superblocks, which is a city-run initiative about pedestrianizing junctions, and over time, relinking those pedestrianized spaces with increased greenery and better pedestrian connectivity. Over time, the Superblocks initiative has the effect of cooling the climate, which is incredibly important because of climate emergency and cities getting hotter, especially cities that are already very hot, like Barcelona, many months of the year. And you could say that Barcelona had become, is known for Sagrada Familia, but it is also known for having the Superblocks initiative, which inspires many other cities. So in Vienna, for instance, where we also had looked at a city program called Grätzl Oase, which is giving residents financial support and organizational support to realize projects on their street in the public space. In one of the city districts, the residents sort of had come up with the initiative to realize so-called Super Grätzl, and this is inspired by Barcelona Superblocks. So you can see how these initiatives, equally, we could look at the 15-minute city and the phenomenon of this term, which sort of emerged through the initiative of the mayor of Paris, who wants to realize a 15-minute city there. And it is an idea developed by Carlos Moreno and sort of drawing on the principles of Jane Jacobs back in the 60s in New York City. So it's not a new idea, but it is really being championed and pioneered in Paris and many other cities. We hear talking about the 15-minute city, especially off the back of the pandemic, which had made cities really reflect on how they deliver services and amenities for their citizens, how they make cities more livable, because urbanization will continue and more people will continue to move into cities, even though during the pandemic, some cities were very badly affected by COVID and overcrowding, if you like, and sort of the competition for resources and amenities. So I think these moments of crisis are always moments to reflect on how can we do things differently. And the idea of meanwhile city and temporary interventions is something that you can test and experiment with relatively quickly. And it has the potential to change the course of the city's development and change behavior of people, sort of incentivize behaviors that are more in tune with the planet and with the way that we want to kind of be in balance with our surroundings.
When I think about the meanwhile use in the cities, I think about different projects. There is a vast scope of them. Some of them might cost 1,000 euro, but some of them, I guess, they might cost a couple of 100,000 euros. How can we differ them? And who is responsible for those meanwhile projects? Because I can just think of that if you create a meanwhile use in a public space, which will last for long and is of a big scale, there has to be a big budget for it.
Yeah, so contrary to what people might think, meanwhile projects are not for free. So they are low cost compared to permanent public space transformation because, a square meter of the street in the cities is very, very expensive. I don't think I should be quoting any figures because in every city it is different. But actually, it's a lot of money that goes into curbs, paving, streets, etc.
Who do you think can start such a process and how can it be founded?
Yeah, so for Meanwhile City, for the book, we've looked really far and wide at Meanwhile projects which are bottom-up, city-led and developer-led or led by private investors or even brands. So Meanwhile projects can be really initiated by anyone who wants to improve a place. And the reasons why people do those projects are also very varied. So let's say for private investors, usually, or for developers, it's about either changing perception of a place if they're working on a big master plan in an area which has been previously run down or actually hasn't been really integrated within the city. So it's about actually getting people reacquainted with the part of the city, changing the perception from negative to positive. The city-led initiatives, very many of those are to do with green mobility. So if we look at cities like New York, where Janet Sadikan, the transport commissioner at the time, had led a whole program of transformation of junctions and squares and streets. And we all probably have heard about the transformation of the Times Square, so pedestrianization of Times Square. But the crucial role of temporary interventions there, which was temporary trials, which were done together with the Gale architects who are based in Copenhagen, where you are. They have just used, 374 beach chairs that they've put on Times Square, and then they were measuring how the traffic flows have adjusted around in the streets around, and that there wasn't actually a negative effect on traffic. The traffic was even actually faster in some streets afterwards. And they were building a case for the city to make that big capital investment into the permanent transformation, which had also led to scaling up this process across 70 different squares and junctions in New York City, and dozens of kilometers of changed road profiles and segregated cycle paths. So very often the city-led initiatives have to do with streetscape and with public space, which is because the city is in charge of streets in most cases, and even initiatives like the sort of loose street furniture. So, it started with Bryant Park, again in New York City, the sort of the Bryant Park chair, but now we can find this initiative also in Prague, and we can see it in Bratislava. It's called Sadnisi, which translates to sit down. It's a little bit less strict in the Slovak version, but but sit down is about really inviting people to sit without it's not a cafe. It's just loose bistro chairs and tables, different spots around the city where people can eat their own food or just hang out and meet with their friends. And contrary to the belief that this loose street furniture at odd places in the city would encourage sort of antisocial behavior and gathering of some sort of criminal activity, actually it's the opposite. It enlivens spaces and many kind of little shop fronts or organizations or little galleries in front of which this street furniture is, then sort of naturally take care of it. They bring it indoors overnight and then they put it out. So there's an element of stewardship that develops, and this relationship between the city and the different actors, sort of the businesses and then also the public. There's this sense of what we talked about at the beginning of this relationship building to the place and fostering this sort of caring relationship. So you're not minded to destroy this furniture. Actually, the cases of it being kind of vandalized or even taken away are very, very rare. Yeah, so we talked about who runs these projects and how much they cost. So the kind of citywide initiatives, they take much longer to set up. But then once the frameworks are in place, then they can be scaled up quite quickly. So I already mentioned Revitalize in Vienna, which is a program where residents can apply to realize projects on their streets. And Junges Grätzl is specifically targeting children and young people. And this initiative started in 2015 and had supported over 500 projects over the course of 6-7 years. And it had even escalated during COVID, when there was much more need for people to socialize outdoors because of the restrictions and social distancing and the threat of the disease. So that's a great example. But of course, it had taken even a time to get to the point of launching the project. So we would have to look at that and what it all entailed. It's part of the Locale Agenda 21 initiative, which is active in most of the city districts by now. But equally, if we look at things like school street initiatives, so in London, there's Hackney School Streets, which Hackney is one of the boroughs of London. And it had started with 3 or 4 pilot trials where they close the roads in front of primary schools during the drop-off and pick-up time. And it had been scaled up to over 40 schools since. So I think, getting through the first project or the pilot or setting up the framework, that is where most of the work is in. And the local authority needs to have the resource and the funding for that. So particularly the resource, because these city-run projects, it's not just about financing, it's about having people with the understanding and the skill and sort of the interpersonal skills to be able to negotiate with the different stakeholders and partners in the process and to get everyone motivated. And this was the case with New York City, where Janet Sadiq Khan, as a person, of course, it was the Department of Transport, and there were many other partners and funding and consultants who had helped. But herself, as somebody who had been really flying the flag of why this is important and doing lots of the lobbying on the ground, was crucial. So all these projects need their champions and the individuals who kind of give the initiative the voice and the face sometimes.
Would you add anything else to the list of a successful project? Anything that makes a temporary use project successful? Any more requirements for that?
What quite a lot of respondents in our interviews during the research for the book had said is that, meanwhile, temporary projects shouldn't be driven by marketing objectives. And this is quite an important point, I think. There is nothing wrong with having some marketing objectives, and of course, investor-led projects and developments will have those criteria, perhaps more than city-led projects where it's more about the civic benefits. But the bottom line is about creating these win-win scenarios so that the projects that you create, whether you are a public or a private organization or even a bottom-up initiative, because even a bottom-up initiative can create a project which is not inclusive for everyone. It can be just for one bubble. So the projects that tend to be successful are those that are win-win for everyone. So they create benefits across the board and they are additive in the city environment. So even for the people who don't necessarily go there as a destination or don't necessarily use the project, they have a sense that actually this project hadn't been detrimental, that actually it brought something positive to their neighborhood, to their street, or to the city. And in order to do that, there's a lot of consultation or engagement involved with the different stakeholders and building trust, particularly in large-scale, big regeneration projects. It's always about building trust with the local authorities, with the residents, with the future users. And it's a process where we have seen that meanwhile interventions or meanwhile projects can be really helpful. So instead of having a consultation process where you are presenting an idea and you're asking people whether they like it or not, which tends to be the kind of traditional consultation process, or you are presenting a number of options and people are like, A, B, C, or D. And in fact, some people feel like, well, there isn't an option for me that I feel reflects my needs. We have seen that sometimes these meanwhile projects are actually making things in a participatory way. Not all meanwhile projects are participatory, but some of them can be, and some of them can be used as engagement tool or consultation tool. They have a lot more potential to kind of really get to the core of what people need and creating a space where those conversations are much more authentic and natural, and either through the process of making or engaging people into an activity rather than engaging them into commenting about, whether they like something or not. A good example perhaps is the Ebury Edge project that Jan Katijn Architects had done for Westminster Council. It's a regeneration of a council estate where the buildings were in bad disrepair and the council had failed to sort of get people on board with the fact that the buildings actually have to be demolished and and there's a new project that needs to happen because they weren't able to salvage the building stock anymore. And of course, that's a really painful conversation to have with residents, even though their homes weren't fit for purpose anymore. A regeneration project takes many years, and people don't want to be dislocated, and so on and so forth. So Yankatan Architects had been approached to do a meanwhile project, which was creating a community space and a series of co-working spaces and an outdoor space, which was through time shaped with the residents, and the residents had really embraced it as their own. And it's a wonderful story of how actually doing things, making things, and trying and experimenting is much more helpful than presenting fixed proposals, and where meanwhile can be really useful.
Once this regeneration project is done, or once this meanwhile temporary use is introduced to a space, it often happens that it becomes very attractive. So there are more and more people coming and it becomes popular. There are new pop-ups, new cafes, and new restaurants maybe. And it might lead to a process called the gentrification, where the prices just rise up, and some of the people that lived in such a space, they are pushed out because of the rising rents, and in general, it's more expensive to live in a certain place. So is a gentrification something that we should avoid, or not necessarily, because in a way it also improves the city and it raises its attractiveness?
Yes, I mean, gentrification is always sort of the elephant in the room. And of course, by making places more attractive, there is a danger that they become unaffordable to some people, and some people who had been located in that area before, perhaps. It's a really difficult question to answer in a simple way. And I would say it is, again, case by case, but the awareness about, let's say, the dangers of sort of displacing people from a location needs to be on the mind of those commissioning the projects or doing the regeneration processes, and again, the public sector, local authorities, cities, by having very clear conditions for private sector coming in to finance and deliver those projects and deliver those regeneration benefits for them. I mean, different countries have different processes in place, how to safeguard what is called so-called social value. And I'm much more familiar with the UK regulations and planning process, so I can speak to that. But there are different mechanisms in the planning process called Community Infrastructure Levy and Section 106, which demand and give very clear criteria for social value and investment into infrastructure and amenities for big regeneration projects. And sometimes the private sector can sort of whittle out of it by making a financial contribution, which in itself is not bad, that there's a financial contribution for those services and amenities that the local authority can then realize for the residents. But in better cases, it is that actually that social value is delivered through the project. And I could mention King's Cross, which is a big regeneration project in North London, where as part of the social value obligations, for instance, there was a meanwhile project, a construction skills centre, which was and is still on the site of the King's Cross master plan, which had been in construction the master plan had been in construction for some 20 years, and it will be completed over the next 2 to 3 years. And the Construction Skills Centre is a training centre in partnership with the local authority, funded by the developer, which is training people into the construction centre, as the name of it says. And that has been, according to the local authority, the most successful meanwhile use really on site. And then also the Skip Garden, which is a community garden that had started in a couple of skips quite early in the process of constructing the master plan, and then had been able to move around to different locations on site, and it had grown in its scope, and it had engaged a huge amount of people from school children to students and local residents they have actually agreed a 999-year lease for a permanent location at King's Cross this year with Argent, who is the developer. So that's a beautiful example where you can see that a meanwhile use, which had started very small, in order to kind of try and experiment whether this relationship, with the developer and Global Generation, who is the charity managing the garden, they needed to also build the trust between each other to grow in scope of this project. And then as it grew and moved around the site, and it had been a huge success, it had gotten to the point where it had become really part of the story of King's Cross, and now effectively a parcel of land within the site is being given over to what is now called the Story Garden permanently. So I think it's really difficult, coming back to your point about gentrification, because in cities where there is a global pressure, cities like New York, London, really, really global cities. And this is, all cities are becoming to a degree global cities, even the smaller cities. I mean, you mentioned a small town in Poland, which with the 15-minute phenomenon also is becoming a city which kind of touches on the global agendas. I think it's really, really difficult to navigate the phenomenon of gentrification. And the word gentrification, generally speaking, has negative connotations. But you also pointed out there is also a positive effect of actually making spaces more attractive, more safe and beautiful and so on. It is a really fine line to thread. Also, when it comes to ownership of public space, is it public or is it semi-public or is it semi-private or is it private? All of these layers come into it. And, what are the restrictions at the end of the day if the space isn't genuinely public? Anna Minton has written a brilliant book about this called Ground Control, where she talks about the whole phenomenon of the emergence of business improvement districts and the kind of private management of public space, and where can this escalate to when things are unbalanced. So I think it's always about trying to find it balance.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the gentrification is already a very complicated topic, and there have been so many books about it, so many articles. You can argue, right, whether it's good or bad, and I think it depends mostly on the perspective. Because if you are a developer or even someone living around such an area, you would like this to be even more popular, more attractive, and more expensive, because then this is also where you get your income. But if you are a citizen that unfortunately has to move out because of this rise of the prices, it is a completely different story. So maybe just to close off our discussion, let's come back to the book, to the publication, to the Meanwhile City, because I've already made myself familiar with the book. But why is it worth checking the Meanwhile City, in your opinion?
I think it's really showing the potential of meanwhile projects and temporary interventions as a collection of projects across different topics. We talked about the green mobility, but we also talk about, how to engage children and young people. We also look at how retail is changing, sort of community spaces, or sort of creating more social spaces in the city. So Meanwhile City book is a collection of case studies, and it shows the breadth of how powerful meanwhile projects can be in long-term transformation and in creating long-term value. And it's really for everyone. So it's for local authorities, cities, it is for developers or investors, but also for citizens and organizations, citizen initiatives. It's trying to showcase, what are the key ingredients that go into creating a successful meanwhile project. And it has 3 in-depth interviews from the perspective of an architect who's doing meanwhile projects, Jan Katain, and then from the perspective of the city, which is represented by Rosalia Kasparova from the city of Prague, and then from a perspective of a developer, which is Martin Evans from UNI, the regeneration developer. And they go really in depth into the sort of nitty-gritty issues about how do you embrace meanwhile projects as part of the phase 0, if you like, of transformation in the city, rather than being an add-on. So it's The book is about how these projects are an integral part of city making, and they always had been. In a way, the phenomenon of meanwhile had been fueled by different moments of crisis. Back in 2008, the financial crisis, but even earlier, in the 70s and in the 50s. I mean, all of these moments of crisis, and now climate emergency, the COVID pandemic, and there will be other pandemics we're sure to follow. So it's showing how those moments can be moments of opportunity, and to think about how to transform cities. And we hope that it provides a lot of inspiration. It doesn't encompass all the answers, of course, but it is a starting point and an inspiration for cities or organizations or people who had thought about doing these projects, but they hadn't really quite gotten to how. And hopefully it gives them some tools to start on this journey and see the benefits that these projects can generate.
So that would be the biggest takeaway, because you also write it in the book. So you've read this guide, and what now? And you suggest starting to look at the unused places as opportunities.
Absolutely. Hopefully you will find it inspiring. And thanks for having me on the podcast, Marcin. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for listening to our conversation with Petra, and I hope that it was very informative and useful for you. No matter if you are an urban leader, practitioner, or private developer, or maybe a citizen who wants to influence his own city. If you would like to make yourself familiar with the book Meanwhile City, it is available online for free in a PDF form, and you will find the link to the book in the episode's description. If you would like to ask additional questions to Petra, or maybe share some thoughts, ideas, you can also contact her directly, and I will also add the link to contact her in the episode's description. So far, thank you very much for listening to the Temporary Use. I'm glad that you joined us today, and talk to you in 2 weeks.